I am doing great, Professor Khalid Alexander. All right, we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started since it is 1 o'clock. It is so good to see you all again. And I have the honor of introducing Professor Khalid Alexander, who will introduce our closing keynote speaker, State Senator Sydney Kamlager. Privilege of working with Khalid on a few fronts, some of which include the fight against mass surveillance of communities, mostly communities of color here in San Diego. Professor Alexander comes from a long line of Americans who, despite the odds, have always worked for social justice and a better world. He pursued an MA in comparative literature at San Diego State University and became a Fulbright scholar in Damascus, Syria. In addition to being a full-time English professor, he spearheaded the annual Social Justice and Education Conference at San Diego City College. He is the president and the founder of Pillars of the Community, a nonprofit community organization that works with those targeted by law enforcement for meaningful systemic change. He founded the Reclaiming Our Stories Collective in 2015, which recently published a second volume of narrative essays written by individuals from impacted neighborhoods. Currently, he and Pillars of the Community are focused on challenging racist gang laws that target Black and Brown residents. And above all else, he is a proud resident of Southeast San Diego, where I too live, and where he is raising 3 children with his wife, Raquel.
Thank you, Genevieve, for the introduction. Let me start by saying when we first started talking about the conference and some of the keynote speakers, I had recently heard Senator Kamlager on the assembly floor talking about AB 333. And so immediately when I heard her name, I said, I want to introduce Senator Kamlager. I want to introduce Senator Kamlager. And once I found out, yes, that I would be introducing Senator Kamlager, it might have been the next day, I was like, oh shit, I got to introduce Senator Kamlager. And you know, introducing people is easy, but introducing people that you have a deep amount of respect for, introducing people who are in many ways your hero is not, particularly when you have 2 to 3 minutes to do so. And so what is the solution to that? The solution is easy. You just speak longer than 2 or 3 minutes until whoever the host is turns off your camera and puts you on mute. Just kidding, kind of. Just kidding, kind of. Last week, I had the opportunity to meet with Senator Kamlager in her office. And in addition to being able to benefit from her intelligence and listening to her passion and her insight into many issues, I also saw that she had not 1, not 2, maybe more than 3 posters and pictures of Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass is, a personal hero of mine, and somebody that I think is very important for us all to know and to be aware of. And he's important because he's somebody who witnessed the horrors of US history. He's somebody who experienced firsthand the brutality of white supremacy. And despite those experiences, he decided that he would fight to make this country better. Because of that, he gave us hope. Because of that, he also was a hero. Senator Kamlager, along those lines, is also a hero. But she's more than just that. She, like Douglass, is somebody who recognizes the horrors of US history, who, despite the difficulties of her job, despite the many obstacles that come in the way, has decided to continue to fight and make this country better. She makes me proud to be a Black American. At Pillars of the Community, we've been advocating for people impacted by unfair and racist gang laws for a long time now. Senator Kamlager gives me hope for our future. She's the author of AB 333, but more importantly, she's a humble representative of the people and a passionate advocate for all of our rights. She makes me proud, she gives me hope, please, everybody, join me in welcoming a social justice warrior, a representative of the people, Senator Kamlager.
Thank you so much. I have to clap for that. That was amazing. I was thinking as you were saying those wonderful words, Professor Khalid, I was like, who is he talking about? He is not talking about me. So I don't know where everyone is. I am in Los Angeles and it is a sunny, warm day. There is an amazing breeze. And so the fact that you all are participating in this conference, hopefully, on a Sunday that is beautiful where you are, really reveals your commitment to this issue and ultimately your commitment to freedom. So I'm really honored to have the opportunity to share this time with you all. I know it's been long. It's probably been very powerful and sobering and provocative. And some of you all may want to have a glass of wine or a nice taco after this. So I am going to try and be as informative and provocative as possible. I am Sydney Kamlager. I'm a senator for the 30th Senate District. I represent a good chunk of the heart of Los Angeles, all of Culver City and a little bit of Inglewood. I have some of the poorest communities in the state of California, and I have some of the wealthiest communities in Los Angeles as well. I am a Black woman married to a Black man with Black children. And I am reminded of those realities every single day. And that is one of the reasons why I have planted my flag in the criminal legal space. But for me, it's not necessarily about the criminal legal system. It's actually about economic equity and economic justice for Black and Brown communities. And I believe that the criminal legal system plays an enormous role in how we are forced and kept into poverty. And unless you are able to change the economic game, it is so easy for the dominant culture to continue to negotiate your freedom and manage your freedom using the tools that legislatures and courts give them through the criminal legal system. Last week, I was listening to this podcast about this young man who lives in the Northwest, and he's blind. He lost his eyesight at a very young age, legally blind. Neither of his eyes work. And he has been interviewed by so many people who see him as amazing because, no pun intended, because he rock climbs, he hikes in the mountains, he rides a bike everywhere. And he communicates using these clicks. And so what makes him so amazing is that he is a blind person who is able to do all of these things. And so he has talked about like doing these interviews and sharing with folks that he's blind, but it doesn't mean he can't see. That he has vision, it's just a different kind of vision. And in fact, he's not exceptional, he's quite average, quite normal. The issue is the construct that the physically seeing society has placed on him and other people who are blind. And our construct of what we expect from blind people, our expectations that we lower when it comes to blind people or people with disabilities, becomes reality. Because so many folks collectively have either bought into this construct or have helped design it. And he talked about how those constructs actually become reality. And then what happens is blind folks then believe the construct and lower their own expectations of themselves and what they can do. So he's like, I can see, but you all act like I can't, and you treat me like I can't. So when you see me riding a bike, you say, oh my God, you're not supposed to be able to do that. Therein lies the problem of how we end up with prejudices and stereotypes, and how we place guardrails around the expectations and success, and ultimately the emancipation of different groups. And I was thinking about my gang bill when I was listening to the podcast, because I was thinking, yeah, that's exactly what we've been doing for so many years when it comes to Black and Brown communities and this notion of gangs. How we see men mostly, our expectations of them, our assumptions of them when there's more than one of them together talking, coming from a certain neighborhood, wearing certain kinds of clothes. And then if collectively we have accepted these assumptions because of a couple of anecdotes, certainly because of some movies that we've seen and amazing screenwriters, then those perceptions and assumptions create the architecture that becomes law, stereotypical, prejudicial law. And we end up in this strange space where we're pitting public safety against racial persecution. And how do we unpack that? And I think at the root of it is going back to some very core fundamental realities and freedoms like due process. And that's sort of been the genesis for this bill, AB 333. So then, of course, after listening to that, I started cooking and was, feeling optimistic. And then I was reminded of this story in 2011 about this young Black teenager who was in Stockton in the little convenience store trying to buy something. He had a dollar bill that was, kind of torn on the edge. The cashier was giving him a hard time. It wasn't a counterfeit. It wasn't broken in half, but it was a little old. You could still spend it. And the person behind him happened to be an off-duty police officer. Mayhem ensued. Man jumped on the brother, knocked his teeth out, and in his report said, he looked dangerous. I thought he was a drug dealer. I thought he was in a gang. And he was harassing the cashier. So then that, of course, I ended up oversalting the dinner and I needed a couple of extra glasses of wine, but it reminded me once again of why AB 333 is so important and why we're doing it. And so what is it? It's getting back to basics. It's talking about the fact that 96% of the folks that are in the Cal Gang database are Black and Brown. It's pushing back on the discussions that I have had with DAs who have told me that white gangs are not as dangerous as Black and Brown gangs in the state of California. Can you believe that BS? It's pushing back on the fact that now we have a system where, because of legislation and also because of propositions, which I am not able to correct on my own, those propositions have to be repealed or fixed by the voters. And because of, quite frankly, the STEP Act in 1988 that labeled Black and Brown men as super predators and was a federal piece of legislation that really cemented how we see brothers in our community. We have had a lot to unravel, and it has been very hard to do it because it is so much more difficult to tackle fears that someone has. And it is even harder to ask people to lean into hope. And these bills and propositions that have been passed years ago that are still in law today were rooted in people's fears. It is easy to lean on. When you have no other excuse, you go back to that. So 1988 STEP Act, I think 2000 Prop 21, Prop 47. These were enhancements to gang penalties. They were doubling down on keeping folks in prison a lot longer. And so our bill is actually called 333, the STEP Act, and we're trying to repeal some of those things. So currently, if you are engaged in criminal activity and you are charged with a crime, the DA is responsible for proving beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed that crime. They have to prove to the jury, 12 of your peers. Generally speaking, juries, when they sit down, really want to know the evidence associated with the charges. And they do want to have enough evidence that will help them decide beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed the crime. But here, if you tack on this gang allegation, it's a special circumstance, and you don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone is in a gang. That conjoined charge is essentially true or false. They can spend all the time talking about the evidence that they have related to the activity or the behavior that you committed that was criminal. But in the beginning, when the DA gets up and provides an opening statement, they will go through all of the things that they know about the defendant. And then they will say, and he's in a gang. And you know this is true. You hear that word and you think Training Day, you think Colors, you think Menace to Society, you think Boys in the Hood, you think about some documentary you saw, you think back to, Monster. And I don't know if jurors spend the rest of the time listening to the allegations and the charges and the evidence around the activity. They are looking at someone probably not exhibiting any facial expressions, maybe with some tattoos, probably has a hairstyle that makes them uncomfortable, and is maybe not exhibiting remorse in a way that registers as appropriate behavior or response to jurors. And so then that becomes very easy to prove that someone is in a gang. And it sticks. And then someone may be given 5 to 7 for the criminal activity, and then 15 for the allegation. And then I can tell you that person is in prison for probably the majority of their formative years. And you lose generations, blocks, years of men and women's time when they would be starting a family, when they would be finishing school, when they would be getting their first job, when they would be transitioning from a first to a second job, when they would be looking to get their first house, when they would be celebrating the birth of their grandchild, when they would be getting married, when they would be getting divorced, all of those things that generally tend to happen in someone's early 20s and early 30s. All those experiences stalled, stunted, erased. And then a new life has to happen in prison because of these gang enhancements. So here in our lovely state of California, as progressive as we are, Some examples that would make a person part of a gang include hanging out in a neighborhood, which police have designated as a gang safety zone, tattoos, being in Instagram photos with family members and friends who are alleged gang members, appearing in a rap video, having a family member in a gang, being arrested in a neighborhood with a person who police suspect being involved in a gang, certain clothing, attending the funeral of a murdered alleged gang member, the color of your grandmother's house. I know a young man, he went to high school here in LA, Dorsey. Middle-class family, comes from a middle-class family, was driving, never in a gang, happened to get stopped. Now they checked his car. He did have a gun. He was not supposed to, you shouldn't have guns. He had a gun here in LA. Sometimes people will say it's better to be caught with one than without one, depending on where you live. And the police officer said, "Do you know anyone in a gang?" Well, he said, "Well, my cousin is in a gang." So he was charged with having a weapon, and he was charged with being a gang member because he answered the question honestly about if he knew someone, not if he was in a gang, if he knew someone. And those are the kinds of reports that are then used against young men and women here in our DA's offices and in our courts. And then those young men go into the gang database. And it is far harder to get off of it than it is to get on it. In fact, here you have to register annually. So you could actually have been in a gang and you could have aged out and you still are responsible for annually registering. I don't know any other thing that is like that. And if you don't, then you have committed actually a crime, and then that could actually be used against you if you are stopped. So Assembly Bill 333 works to do three things. The first thing is it works to bifurcate the charges. So it says if you are going to charge someone with a crime, charge them. Prove those charges. Then come back and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person is in a gang. The goal is to maintain a defendant's due process throughout the entire lifespan of all of the trials or charges. Because we know that DAs have been leaning on these very arcane, racist, racialized tools to make it far easier for them to get W's, to get wins. And as a result, we see swaths of our communities labeled with a scarlet letter that is a gang. And it makes it incredibly harder to defeat. And it wouldn't be a problem if there was a little more racial equity in the Cal Gang database. The second thing that the bill does is it says you have to establish that this actually is a gang. It cannot be 3 or 4 Latino brothers and sisters hanging out, or 3 or 4 African Americans hanging out. It cannot be 3 or 4 folks that happen to have some hue of blue on them. Especially now with COVID, people are either wearing masks or they're wearing the gaiters or they're wearing bandanas. So if that means that you just happen to be wearing a red bandana because you don't want to wear a mask and you're trying to protect, everyone else because of COVID, could you be alleged to be in a gang? And I have to tell, and then the third thing it does is it says that you cannot say that someone committed a crime just for the sake of committing the crime. It has to be for a crime that is more than reputational or more than for the benefit of the gang. So these 3 things have caused me immense consternation. I authored this bill. We did a lot of our research. We got to the Committee in Public Safety. It passed. It got to the floor. We happen to have a couple of vacancies here because of some special elections. You know, one of our assembly members moved on to becoming the Attorney General. Another of our assembly members moved on to become the Secretary of State. I actually moved from the Assembly to the Senate. And so we had a couple of vacancies. And the bill died. It essentially stalled. With 38 votes, we needed 41. And so we asked for a reconsideration. I made a strategic decision to ask a very conservative Democrat to floor jockey the bill on the Assembly side, because I had talked to him. And while he doesn't like gangs, I certainly don't like gangs. I am not a fan of criminal gangs. He did understand due process and that everyone has a right to due process. And it's true. You can be a gang member. You can be a Proud Boy gang member. You can be a Crip gang member. You can be someone who's protesting outside of an abortion clinic. You can be someone who is protesting for Black Lives Matter. Everyone deserves due process in the courts. And he got that. But nonetheless, it failed. And so we asked for reconsideration to bring it back. And in that time, we had to have real discussions with the District Attorneys Association that was adamantly opposed to this about those three things. They said, oh, if you bifurcate the charges, it will make it too hard to prove. I don't understand why you would want me to pass a bill that says it is okay to practice lazy law in the courts. When you are responsible for deciding someone's freedom, it is your responsibility to find evidence and prove evidence. And if you can't do that, then stop leaning on something else that will give you an easy pass. WTF. And I think at the very least, if you are talking about taking someone's freedoms away from them for possibly 15 years, 25 years, life, don't you think the bar should be as high as possible? Don't you think the evidence that you are using should be as strong as possible? Are you kidding me? They came back and they said, oh, these gangs, they're not organized. We've been following these gangs for years. We've got gang experts. I said, excuse me, you don't have gang experts. You have someone who's watched a couple of videos, who's trolling the internet, who was a beat officer on the street and picked up a little slang and knows the kind of jargon to use to make regular constituents and citizens afraid. You're not no police expert, gang expert. I'm a gang expert. Hell, I got family members who have been shot by gangs. I know people in gangs. I'm an expert. We've got gang experts. Miss, they said, I don't want to offend you, but I don't really think you know what you're talking about. That's what the man told me. But we have these gang experts, and we don't have the kind of resources that we would need to prove that these are real organizations. This isn't like the mafia. These are just, fluid, highly unorganized groups out here creating mayhem, committing violent acts and scaring little old ladies. That was what the man said in committee. So once again, stop being so lazy. You can define what organized means. I think gangs are incredibly organized. They have lieutenants. People generally don't go off on their own and do whatever they want to do. They do check in with a supervisor, even if that's not what they're calling the person. They have ways of communicating. They're using burner phones in certain ways. They're tracking, using certain technologies, where to go. They have ways of communicating through graffiti, whose territory you're in, who you should be looking out for. They have ways of keeping eyes on where the police are and how long you may have to commit a crime. They have incredible intel. The streets know a lot more than we give the streets credit for. So I think it's pretty presumptuous and really disrespectful to assume that they're not organized. Because if they weren't that organized, they'd be easier to catch. Now, wouldn't they? The third thing is that, oh, this should not be more than just for the benefit of the gang, because sometimes people are just going out, and committing these crimes for respect. It's just about because initiation for the gang, which I think goes back to, the second point and the arguments against the second point that they make. If that is in fact what they're doing, then it is for some kind of organized structure, isn't it? Right? So they're just not doing it for the sake of doing it. It is for how you can sort of perpetuate the brand that is the gang, that is the business, how you sustain its legitimacy and its strength. And that particular individual is not making those decisions without getting some sort of approval from someone who is higher up. So you can't have it both ways. The DA Association doesn't really seem to believe that. So we had to work really hard to get people to a place where we could get the 41 votes. And we leaned quite heavily on due process, but it was really hard. I have a colleague of mine on the assembly side who our sons go to the same school, and we have bonded over that. And if you can believe it, it's a school that espouses Jesuit principles around liberation theology and seeing people as they are and social justice activism. And I was talking to her about this bill, and she said, yeah, my son went to the store by the school and with his friend, and this kid was behind him and punked him, essentially, and scared him because the guy was like, you cut in front of me. And she said, so, well, what did he look like? And the young boy said, well, he was Black and he had braids. I think he was in a gang. So it was so interesting because while I was trying to argue with this woman about the merits of this bill and how we should sort of eliminate racial profiling and focus on people's rights, she was like, yeah, Black guy with braids scaring my son, think he's in a gang. Can't go up on the bill. So we were able to get it through. And now it has gone over to the Senate side. It has gotten out of Senate Public Safety Committee. I will say that the reasons why it got out of both committees was because I happened to be on the Assembly Public Safety Committee in the Assembly, and I'm on Public Safety Committee in the Senate, but we still have a hurdle getting it off the floor. And I don't know how to tap into people's fears. I do know how to tap into people's beliefs that your rights should be protected. It doesn't matter if you like someone. It doesn't matter if they've done something wrong. That is why you have the law. And our problem is we want laws and justice to be blind, but only when it pertains to people that don't make us uncomfortable. And we really have to address that contradiction, because it is that contradiction that has led us down this road for an incredibly long time, where we have systemically locked up certain folks. They're poor folks who have to lean on public defenders and public counsel. They're Black and brown folks who don't know their rights, or who have had some circumstances in their past that make it easier for the system to double down, not on their innocence, but on their perceived guilt. And we have a system that works based on the number of people that revolve in its system on a continuum. So I believe that DAs and public defenders and judges actually like having people in their courtrooms, because it means they are working. And the more ways we can find ways to charge people, the more work we give the system. And so it doesn't mean figure out a way to not have them work, but it does mean figure out a way to have people work harder and focus on the values that are most important, which are these inalienable rights. So that when you are not able to lean on these weak and arcane tools, it forces you to do other things. How else can you use the system? And the hope is that with all of this sort of push around criminal legal reform, that we can collectively sort of ask the system to focus in spaces that have been overlooked or underutilized, or have underperformed, or have been underfunded in a way that can be more successful for communities that have been disproportionately targeted for generations and for years. So one of the things that I shared that leads me to believe that we have to continue to fight to get gang enhancements off the books was this case from a few years ago that involved this young man who was a Crip. He had his blue bandana, he had his signs, he was wearing his colors, he was posting on Instagram all the places he was going and what he was going to do. He had tattoos. He'd actually been involved in a couple of murders of some folks. So remember, he did all of those things that I listed out in the beginning about examples that police officers use to allege that someone is a gang member. All those things that I just told you he did. So he was charged. He was charged with the murder. Gang allegation not levied against him. The lawyer said, he's not in a gang. He was working on a documentary. He wanted to know what it was like to be in the life, but he's not a gang member. And the jury agreed and said, you're right. He did all those things, but he was not a gang member. He was not in a gang. This young man, 18-year-old white man from Palos Verdes. Now, I know someone else. I know this young man personally. In a gang, stuck up a little convenience store, stole a gallon of milk. He had a newborn baby. Baby was hungry. And he stole a tall can of beer. One, not a whole case. He was arrested, charged, robbery, gang allegation. Now, I don't know about you. I mean, I don't hang out. I don't go to gang meetings. But I would find it hard to believe that a lieutenant would say, steal a gallon of milk. and steal one can of beer that then you drink and don't give to me. That's not a story I have yet heard. Charged with a gang allegation for those crimes. So on its own, those crimes would not have, turned into serious time in prison. But with the gang allegation, yes, indeed. So the fact of the matter is, he was in a gang. The other fact of the matter is, he did not do those crimes because he was in a gang. He did those crimes because he did those crimes. He did those crimes because he didn't have any money and he had a hungry baby and, he was thirsty and it was hot. Don't conflate the two, which is why the bifurcation is so important. Now, the gang allegation was dropped, but that his attorney had to fight like hell to prove that those basic facts that I shared. What's it to you, system, to charge someone with a theft, with a robbery? Why are you so invested in giving this young man more time? Why are you so invested in taking this person off the streets? Why is this young man such a danger? Why is it okay that we're making it so easy for you to take away 15 years of someone's life? What do any of us gain? And why is it okay? So it's okay because we've lowered expectations, because we've created these constructs that then become reality about who, generally speaking, Black and brown young men are, and now women. And that is what this bill is all about. I have said it each time that I have talked. I am not a fan of gangs. They are doing more harm to our communities, quite frankly, than white folks are. My mother tells me all the time, white folks are like, you know what? I ain't got to worry about y'all. Y'all are taking care of yourselves on your own. So that's a whole other conversation. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be asking people to do the work when it comes to the possibility of taking years away from someone's life. And it doesn't mean that everyone should not be treated equally and fairly. They don't deserve any less. No one deserves less than the ultimate highest of standards when you're trying to present and prove evidence. So we have a lot of work to do. I don't know. I believe that this is going to pass. I believe it is going to get to the governor's desk. I hope that this will be something that other states can look to as a model to focus on how we are more restorative and reparative in the work that we have had on the books for decades now, as it relates to how we have racially persecuted communities. Because when you go to a graduation and you look out and you don't see a lot of Black boys and you see fewer Black girls, when you go to college graduations and you see even fewer, when you drive through certain communities and you see the lack of infrastructure and investment, when you go to schools and see how punitive some of the practices are and policies are towards schools that are in lower income communities, when you go about your daily life and observe how the expectations are lowered when someone who's Black or brown enters into this space, I hope you connect all of those things to the years and years and years that we have invested in cementing fear and stereotypical, racialized persecutions of Black and brown people as it relates to gang enhancements and allegations. And you should ask yourself, am I participating in this construct? Am I allowing these expectations to become realities? My friend did when she told me that story about her son in the convenience store. She didn't say that, but she said that. And essentially what she was telling me was that my son, if he showed up and had his hair braided and told somebody to move over, could also, it would not be unfair to assume that he was in a gang. The same child that is going with her child to a school. So we have a lot of work to do, and we have to figure out how to tackle it from the legal space, from a psychological space, from an economic space, from a justice space, and from a policy space. And there is interplay and intersection with all of them. And we have to be really forceful about not allowing our own subjective fears to permeate some of the arguments. Because at the end of the day, I think the root of all of this is, how do we get back to the business of inserting due process that is fair across all of the legal spectrums that we are employing when we are talking about how to enhance public safety, how to protect all communities, and how to make sure that we have a criminal legal system that works for everyone. So I think I'm going to close out, because I know I got on this rant, but this is one of the most personal bills that I have had the privilege of authoring since I have been in the legislature, because it goes to the root of how Black and brown men in particular are viewed and how they are feared. And I'm hopeful that we get to a space where our brothers and sisters are not looked at as being these predatory animals out to harm and desecrate neighborhood after neighborhood. Because it is not the case. It is not the case. And how we can give folks credit on the one hand and then take it away from them at the very next turn is unconscionable. So I hope this is the beginning of a number of steps that really force us to manage and confront the hypocrisies that we have institutionalized into laws in this progressive state called California. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Senator Kamlager. I'm going to invite everyone to unmute themselves if you can, so she can hear the applause. That was truly not a rant.
That was an amazing.
Fire it up.
That is
Hey, I hope nobody wore that. I hope nobody wore that. You stepped on a bunch of toes with all that what you just said. Some people mad at
for
you.
governor.
Beautiful.
Keep it up.
Make sure you stay safe. Thank you for everything you're doing. Keep pushing for us. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
you really
Senator,
did.
just real quick, I know you probably saw a lot of background action for, this is Tom Lemon with the building trades. And I just want to share with you, I'm out here today with a group of young men who are all formerly incarcerated, several of them still wearing ankle bracelets, who all are subject to exactly which have been subject to exactly what you're talking about. This really hits home. This is a program that Jason Shanley, who just weighed in, called Homework, where we're trying to put them into the trades. But this is every one of them, little things that turned into big things because of gang enhancements. I want to be an ally in this place. The building trades in San Diego does. We've reached out, obviously, with Khalid and Pillars of the Community. Super important stuff you're doing. We love you and appreciate you, sister.
Well, thank you, Tom. I'm actually going to need you because I will tell you, and Khalid knows this, the DA's office that has been the most aggressive has been San Diego's. I mean, he was the one who went on a rant in public safety. And I told him, I said, I hope you get a SAG award for this thing you have just said, because you deserve an Emmy. I mean, it was the most grotesque. It was the most racist sort of characterization of people I have heard in a very long time that someone was bold enough to say on a microphone.
I was there and I heard you shut him down. Thank you so much.
Ms. Kamlager, just so you know, there is somebody from the district attorney's office in San Diego on this call. Cheryl Suing Jones is on this Zoom right now from the exact DA's office that you're talking about right now.
I see her. Well, Cheryl, I hope you let Frank know that I have not forgotten him.
Well, let me tell you. So I thought it was very important for you, Senator, to actually hear the reactions and the emotions at what you talked about. You just hit so many things spot on. And as a person who worked in our criminal courts for 13 years as a public defender, I can tell you that what you are talking about when we talk about how jurors decide cases when there is a gang allegation is a completely different animal. And I watched you give your floor speech when you advocated for AB 333, and Khalid also talked about that. When you said everyone deserves due process and those rights must be respected, that means everyone. But within our criminal legal system, as you know, there's a carve out for folks that come from communities like mine, for folks that are young, Black and brown people. And what I really loved about your floor speech was that you talked about how there is this standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but you get a pass when you attach a gang allegation. And in your words, you said it becomes a catch-all for all kinds of alleged crimes in particular neighborhoods. And this is where we see the net that is cast, this wide net cast on certain communities. And so I just want to thank you for your advocacy. I want to thank you for the very strong language that you use and for being unapologetic and for not being afraid to stand for people that most people would never take the time to stand for. So I do want to get into questions. So again, please place questions in the chat. I know that there are a few, we will definitely get to them, but a very general question for you, Senator. Your platform included criminal justice reform that was focused on diversion, focused on redemption and rehabilitation. I want to know, what bills can we look forward to you advancing, sponsoring, or authoring in the near future?
Oh, good Lord. So I am going to stick with this. You know, one of the earlier bills I did was around probation and actually limiting time that folks had on probation so that you cannot get these ticky-tack violations, added to your time, because those actually increase the probability that you remain in poverty and also increase the likelihood that you will become incarcerated. It's like a diet, you cannot be on probation for extended periods of time. It just stops working. So, it's like 1 year, 2 year, that's it. So I'm interested in those kinds of things. I am, this might sound controversial, but I'm very interested in fixing our sex offender registry and how people get on it. I think sex is a very hot topic, and this country has a perverse relationship with sex. What we talk about in the public sphere is very different from how most of us practice behind closed doors. And somehow that stuff gets really twisted when it comes to law. And so I think it is also incredibly easy for folks to be charged with sex crimes because it also has with it strange triggers. And then once you're on, we don't take into consideration certain circumstances that may lead to particular alleged actions. So I want to say, I'm not saying it is okay to rape someone or sexually assault someone. I am saying that how we sort of charge sex crimes should be examined, because there are certain things that I think deserve a little more introspection. I'm also very interested in looking at sort of welfare checks and the relationship between welfare checks and social services and arrests and family separation. I think those things disproportionately happen to Black and Brown communities. It is one of the reasons why so many of our young Black and Brown babies are in foster care. And I really do believe that welfare checks have been weaponized and have turned into code for family separation. And also they've been weaponized against Black and Brown fathers particularly. So I'm very interested in that. We had an incident that happened in my district a few weeks ago where a young couple had a home birth delivery and then there was a medical emergency. They called for medical assistance and a dozen armed police officers showed up, handcuffed the father, and the social worker came out and threatened to take the baby. And so what? It was a welfare check. Not really. And so the other thing that I'm really interested in is what happens inside of our prisons. So currently right now, when you leave, you don't have any access to your medical records. I think that's crazy. So I'm very interested in working on some legislation that will allow folks to have their medical records upon their release. And then I'm also very interested in examining what we label as contraband inside of prisons and how we manage sexual activity in prisons. I think there is some interplay between that and mental and physical health, especially for our men, and what happens upon their release.
So lots of wonderful things in store. And I do want to say that I saw your video on Twitter where you talked about the couple and the right for Black people to be able to use doulas and give birth at home and have that not be criminalized. So I just want to thank you for really being connected with what's happening in our neighborhoods and really being a voice. I think you're the perfect closeout for a Decriminalizing Neighborhoods conference. And we have 1 minute before 2 o'clock, and I want to give you time to prepare for the meet and greet that you actually offered. I want to just thank you for that. But there was a question in the chat about what are your thoughts on going beyond the gang database and moving to a timed expulsion of criminal records? And I know that for at least the second issue, you all are taking that up in the state legislature.
I'm incredibly supportive. I mean, the reality is we really have to re-engineer this system from the rooter to the tutor. That's for all the folks that like pork. Because it's just not working. And so, you have to, I think it's important to seal records. I think it's important to do true expungements. We kind of don't really do true expungements now. It's like all these caveats. That's a hot mess. I think we should have greater access and transparency to police records. All of those things Even when they do investigations with the police officers, they are not allowed to talk about race in those investigations. So when you have internal affairs sort of looking at police misconduct, they're not allowed to talk about race. Are you kidding me? So I think we have to just systematically go and chunk out all aspects of this incredibly large and complicated system, and tackle them. And it's not to, we have to remind people, it's not about giving people a pass. It's not about giving people a pass. It's just about sort of resetting justice, right? So that everyone has equal access to the same resources, right? Or to the same presumptions, right? And to the same set of assets. And we haven't been doing that for a really long time. Mostly because, 400 years ago, some of us weren't even like, human beings, we were property. And so who wants to give up property? But I tell people all the time, I have my card, I am free.
Question, can I ask a question real quick?
Real quick, Nene, we're
Okay,
trying to stay on track.
Real quick. You just said true, they don't give true expungement because my grandson just did his. What do you mean by true expunge your record?
So they do a lot of clinics. They have a lot of expungement clinics, but they still have to give this information to the DOJ. So DOJ still have access to records. And so there are certain things, not always with jobs, because we did the ban the box, but there are certain things that the DOJ still has access to that like employers can, or lending institutions still have access to. So that's what I mean by true expungement. And you have to ask sort of why that is. And so sometimes the higher up you go, the greater clearance you may need. That those entities can say, hey, I'm doing a background check, and they can tap into it through DOJ. So that's what I mean when I say true expungement, because the reasons why we have a lot of economic challenges is because folks are not able to access loans, they're not able to access capital when they're trying to do rent. All of those things can be complicated based on if you go subdural when you're looking into someone's, mostly financial, but their records.
Thank you.
So Senator Kamlager, again, I just want to say thank you so very much. I'm going to give you a running head start as we applaud you so that you and your team can get all set up. But again, just thank you so very much. Thank you. All right, so everyone, I wanted to just make sure that not just giving her a running start, but that we could actually start to place into the chat what our favorite parts of the conference was. Let's do a wrap-up session before we go to the meet and greet. So just place into the chat where however you want to talk about your favorite day or your favorite part. I'm pretty sure a lot of people are going to say that the state senator was your favorite part and that you're going to go into that meet and greet and ask her to run for some higher office. And you can do that. So let's place that into the chat. This was such an amazing conference, and I'm sure that you all agree. So I want to see those comments in the chat. All right, so I'll tell you, my favorite part of this conference was seeing all of the different segments of our communities across jurisdictional boundaries, and all of us engaging in this work of reimagining what it is to truly be safe, whole, and well in our neighborhoods. We have together strategized action for change in our policing systems, rethinking public safety, combating racist policies and legislation, and together we are going to make the change that we so definitely need. I see King Tone's name in the chat as being a great keynote. Absolutely. I'm seeing some direct messages saying this has been mind-blowing. I want to remind folks that the link for the meet and greet in Kumo space is in the chat. We're going to be in room 6 with Senator Kamlager. Now, I want to say this. We've heard from public defenders, college professors, a sitting DA who is actually a good DA. He talked about the label not being progressive, because everybody can just claim they're progressive nowadays, but how about a DA who's actually decarceral and a DA who's not fighting against the changes that we, the people, want to see? We've heard from an incredible state senator. We've heard from credible messengers, educated gangsters, activists, private attorneys, community organization leaders, self-advocates, community advocates, and even members of law enforcement. We looked at gang injunctions, surveillance, and the role of the federal government in gang, drug, and gun enforcements. We've strategized around peace building and building a national network for our movement. And here are some takeaways. We have the answers to the issues that plague our communities. We, the people, do. We, the impacted people, have the answers. We must organize for power. And we discussed creating a national network, and it was suggested that we broaden this network to include more than just the United States. Another takeaway, gangs are not the same as violence. Gangs and violence are not synonymous. We need to talk more about state violence and police murders and strategize against them. We must take what we have learned back to our individual communities and share and use what we have learned here to affect change. And this is whether we are individuals or with organizations. It takes the community to make change. As we saw in San Diego just this year, it took community members pushing and fighting for years to get rid of the gang injunctions in San Diego County that targeted and criminalized neighborhoods like mine, in the face of staunch opposition by the city attorney, by the district attorney, by San Diego's police department's chief, by the San Diego sheriff. They would not be moved until we moved them. It was the people, and it was the power of the people. So we must never hand over our power. Instead, we must act on our power and on our agency. We must take over the narrative that they've force-fed us, and we must continue to challenge the idea of what a gang member is and what a gang member does. As we've looked at during this conference, gang documentation and how it affects deportation proceedings and proceedings in our criminal courts every single day across this country, it is evident that we must fight on every front to get more just and fair outcomes in our courtrooms. We must eradicate racial profiling on our streets, and we must put an end to mass surveillance of communities of color. This is the only way we even start to make the change that we need in our communities to truly be safe. So again, I'm going to say, impacted people are the most knowledgeable about the issues affecting us. So